This encyclical, Laudato Si, has really stirred a great deal of conversation and controversy since its publication a few weeks ago. Barely 10% of the encyclical is devoted to the matter of climate change, but you wouldn't know that if you were reckoning the amount of media coverage that the encyclical has had on that matter alone. But if you've read the encyclical, you know that the Pope is saying a great deal more, and much of that has been contested. It's been embraced by some whom you'd be surprised to think would be embracing Catholic teaching, but it's been embraced by some and criticised by others. Tonight, Dr. Sam Gregg is going to set down, I think, a bit of a roadmap and help us to think again about the encyclical. His talk is entitled Pope Francis, Laudato Si and the Market Economy, Good Intentions, Flawed Economics. Would you please welcome Dr. Sam Gregg?
Thank you very much, Peter. It's very good to be here, and thank you all for coming tonight to take time out of your schedules to be here. It's very good to be back at the CIS. It's very good to see familiar faces. And as you know, my topic tonight is Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, which, as Peter mentioned, has been the occasion of much commentary around the world. And as Peter said, a lot of that has to do with the debate about climate change, a subject which I confess I don't follow closely, on which I have no particular expertise, and which I therefore have nothing to say this evening. Instead, I'd like to focus upon something I like to think I do know a little bit about, which is political economy and some of the economic thinking that underlies the encyclical. Now, again, as I think some of you know, I've been, shall we say, somewhat critical of the economic presumptions, analysis, and recommendations contained in the encyclical. Subjects which I should add, for the most part, Catholics are perfectly free to debate about among themselves and with their fellow Christians and those who don't hold to the Christian faith but who are interested in what significant religious leaders have to say about these subjects. But rather than begin with Laudato Si, I'd like to begin with a document that foreshadowed some of the encyclical's economic arguments, which is, of course, Pope Francis's 2013 apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. Now, some of you will recall that when that document appeared in November 2013, much of the commentary was dominated by six of the exhortation's 288 paragraphs. And this is a shame because Evangelii Gaudium is in many ways a very beautiful document. The emphasis, for example, upon the Trinity's most neglected member, which is the Holy Spirit, in the Church's life, I think was very touching for many people. But for all that, Evangelii Gaudium's 6 paragraphs about the global economy struck many Catholics and many other Christians as being less than convincing. So to be very frank, as Pope Francis is always encouraging us to be, many of the economic claims made in that document and some of its underlying assumptions are very questionable. In some cases, they reflected the straw man economic arguments that you encounter quite often in some Catholic and other Christian circles, especially in Western Europe and Latin America. Prominent among these was the Pope's condemnation of, quote, the absolute autonomy of markets, end quote. This, he said, is at the root of many of our contemporary problems, not least because he said it helps to rationalize an unwillingness to help those people who might be in need. Well, if we follow Evangelii Gaudium's injunction to look at the realities of the world today, you soon discover that there's literally no country in which markets operate with absolute autonomy. In Western Europe, for example, governments routinely control an average of 40% of national GDP. In many developing countries, the percentage is even higher. So how much more of the economy do we really want to put in the hands of the state? Is there no upper limit? I often like to point out that in private correspondence with the Australian economist Colin Clark, even John Maynard Keynes once said that the figure of, quote, 25% of GDP as the maximum tolerable proportion of taxation may be exceedingly near the truth, end quote. Nor, I think, in Evangelii Gaudium was there any real awareness of just how regulated the world's economies actually are. The rules and regulations that apply to economic life in North America and Western Europe, for example, I think are fast approaching the status of being beyond counting. The situation in most developing countries, I think, is hardly any better. In fact, so extensive is the range and scope of regulation that, as I've argued elsewhere, I think it's now creating genuine rule of law problems in many countries. I think the amount of regulation in developed Western economies, for example, is now so great that even good judges with no interest whatsoever in judicial activism are issuing rulings that are ad hoc and arbitrary in nature. Yet another claim made by Evangelii Gaudium that warranted, I think, scrutiny was that, quote unquote, certain ideologies reject the right of states charged with vigilance for the common good to exercise any form of control over the economy, end quote. Well, outside the minuscule world of anarcho-capitalists who exert zero influence upon public policy, this simply isn't the position of most people who favour free markets today, let alone past advocates such as Adam Smith. It's one thing, for example, I think, to be sceptical of the effectiveness of various, even many forms of government intervention into the economy. It's quite another, however, to reject any form of regulation whatsoever. Alongside those comments, we also found Pope Francis critiquing those who, quote, continue to defend trickle-down theories that assume that economic growth encouraged by a free market will inevitably succeed in bringing greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. Such a view, the Pope added, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power. More generally, the Pope said, quote, we can no longer trust in the unseen forces and the invisible hand of the market, end quote. Well, there's several problems with that line of reasoning. First of all, opening up markets throughout the world has helped reduce poverty in many developing countries. East Asia is a living testimony to that reality, and it's a testimony that's, I think, routinely ignored by many Western European Catholics who tend to complain rather self-centeredly about the competition this creates for protected Western European businesses and other recipients of corporate welfare. It's also a reality which I found many, if not most, Latin American Catholics simply have nothing to say about. Second, it's never been the argument of most of us who favour free markets that economic freedom is somehow sufficient to reduce poverty. It's certainly indispensable, but economic freedom alone is not enough. Among other things, you need stable governments that provide infrastructure, you need property arrangements that identify clearly who owns what, and above all, you need the rule of law, which is not mentioned once in Evangelii Gaudium. And rule of law is, to put it mildly, a challenge in most developing nations. The rule of law, lack of rule of law, not only ranks among the biggest obstacles of the ability of poorer countries to generate wealth on an ongoing basis, but I think it also hampers their ability to address economic problems in a just manner. Instead, what you find is crony corporatism, rampant protectionism, and the corruption that's a way of life in Latin America and much of Africa. Moreover, far from insisting that the invisible hand, which of course is a metaphor employed by Smith that merits an entirely different discussion, far from insisting that the invisible hand is enough, many market-orientated scholars have been underscoring for several decades the vital importance of values and institutions in explaining the causes of economic growth and decline. Nobel laureate economists such as Edmund Phelps and Douglas North have deepened our knowledge of how values, expectations, beliefs, rules, and protocols that define a given economic culture help to determine, first of all, whether a country can break the bonds of poverty, or two, whether it goes from wealth to seemingly perpetual economic decline. Pope Francis's native Argentina is, of course, the 20th century's exhibit A of such decline. Or three, whether it enters a state of prolonged stagnation, like Japan in the 1990s or much of Western Europe today. Lastly, there's the issue of redistribution. In numerous places in Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis called for more equitable distribution of resources within and between societies. Now, of course, Catholicism and Judaism and all other forms of Christian confession, for that matter, have from the very beginning emphasized that private property is not absolute. It's also always affirmed that the state has a role in ensuring a more just distribution of wealth. Now, to this, Francis added that some people today find any mention of redistribution issues to be, quote, irksome. Now, personally speaking, I don't find discussions of wealth distribution to be bothersome at all. Catholics and other Christians should, in my view, enter enthusiastically into these debates, because it's precisely through those forms of conversation that it can be pointed out that, as unfortunately Evangelii Gaudium seemed unaware, many poverty alleviation programs that involve redistribution, like foreign aid, are increasingly discredited. I think it was the economist and historian of the Federal Reserve, Alan Meltzer, as he once put it, one of the 20th century's economic lessons is, quote, that transfers, grants, and redistribution did little to raise living standards in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. In other words, the standard wealth redistribution policies, often regarded as indispensable for poverty alleviation, have largely failed to achieve their goals. Hence, I think it behooves all Christians to ask ourselves why such approaches have failed if we're going to have a serious conversation about wealth and poverty in the modern world. Now, my critique of Evangelii Gaudium is by no means intended to imply that everything the Pope said here about economic life is somehow naive or mistaken. As it happens, he said several things that should resonate with those who favour free enterprise and free markets. The Pope stated, for example, that welfare projects should be seen as, quote, temporary responses. He also warned against, quote, the welfare mentality. Evangelii Gaudium also extolled free and creative work. The Pope affirmed that business is, quote, a noble vocation that serves the common good by striving to increase the goods of the world and to make them more accessible to all. Likewise, the Pope's warnings about the tendency for even many Christians to immerse themselves in a culture of prosperity for its own sake are well taken. I think in his own lifestyle, Pope Francis has long been a living reproach to those who think that salvation is going to be found in the possession, use, and accumulation of stuff. Equally important was Evangelii Gaudium's reference to the way in which excessive debt and the accumulation of interest makes it difficult for countries to realize the potential of their own economies, end quote. And yet, for all these and other observations, it was very difficult to come away from reading Evangelii Gaudium without thinking that there were just too many unexamined assumptions about the economy that made their way into that document. Indeed, the Pope himself indicated his awareness that some of his thoughts about poverty and economics would generate criticism. Quote, he said this, "If anyone feels offended by my words, I would respond that I speak them with affection and with the best of intentions, quite apart from any personal interest or political ideology." End quote. Well, I myself took no offence from Evangelii Gaudium's observations about poverty and the economy. In fact, I admire Pope Francis's determination to ensure that we don't lose sight of the material misery in which far too many people continue to live. Francis's words were also a powerful reminder that the Christ's commandment to love the poor is truly non-negotiable for any serious Christian. Nevertheless, as Francis himself wrote, quote, "Ideas disconnected from realities give rise to ineffectual forms of idealism," end quote. And attention to particular realities about economic life was precisely what was missing from parts of Evangelii Gaudium's analysis of wealth and poverty. So, given the degree of criticism of Evangelii Gaudium's economic analysis by people like myself, who are pretty conventional, Orthodox Catholics, some were expecting that the economic commentary contained in Laudato Si might be a little bit more measured. Unfortunately, that turned out not to be the case. In fact, I'm afraid that some of the same tendencies manifested themselves when it comes to the encyclical's commentary on economic subjects. Now, obviously, much of Laudato Si is focused upon trying to influence the world's climate change debate. Moreover, despite the text's occasional wandering into very technical subjects, such as air conditioning's environmental impact, contemporary threats to plankton, the effects of synthetic agrotoxins on birds, or how dams affect animal migration, and yes, all four of these subjects and more are discussed in Laudato Si. The deeper significance of this long, and I have to say, very awkwardly written document, I think will be upon how it shapes theological reflection about man's relationship with the natural world. But while most of the text's reflections upon public issues were more or less on the environment, a subterranean theme that became decidedly visible from time to time is the encyclical's rather negative view of free markets. Now, I think that this seems to confirm that this pontificate's reaction to respectful questions asked about the adequacy of Evangelii Gaudium's economic analysis has simply been to recycle, no pun intended, some of that document's demonstrably flawed arguments concerning the market economy's nature and effects. Now, to be sure, there is much about today's global economy that merits criticism. Laudato Si rightly underscores the problem of bailing out banks at everyone else's expense. Does anyone here doubt that if the world faces another series of major bank failures, governments will behave in exactly the same way as they did in 2008, thereby reinforcing the moral hazard problem that is at the root of so much of the financial sector's dysfunctionality? The encyclical also suggests, correctly in my view, that despite 2008, there has been a major failure to reform the world's financial systems. Likewise, the Pope's tough criticisms of those who regard population growth as somehow damaging the environment and impeding economic development are, in my view, spot on. Nonetheless, many conceptual problems and questionable empirical claims characterize the encyclical's vision of economic life. In terms of environmental degradation, Laudato Si appeared oblivious to the fact that the 20th century's worst economically driven pollution occurred as a result of centrally planned state industrialization schemes in former communist countries. Anyone who's been to Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union, you quickly witness the often devastated landscape. So I think anyone who's been to these parts of the world knows that the biggest polluters in the world in the 20th century were communist, centrally planned economies. Then there's the encyclical's use of this global north and global south language to describe some of the global economy's dynamics. Now, this terminology has been used occasionally by popes in the recent past, but it also reflects the conceptual apparatus of what was called dependency theory. This is the notion that resources, especially natural resources, flow from a periphery of poor countries in the southern hemisphere to a core of rich countries in the northern hemisphere, thereby benefiting the wealthy at the poor's expense. Now, this meant, according to dependency theorists, that peripheral nations should restrict trade with developed countries and limit foreign investment. The point was to reduce their reliance on exports of raw materials and agricultural products, consequently promoting the emergence of domestic industrial sectors. Now, this understanding of the global economy, much of which was formulated by Latin American economists in the 1950s, has long been discredited. Not even many centre-left economists are willing to defend this position anymore. There are, for instance, countries in the South, such as Chile, Australia, and New Zealand, that are classified as developed economies. Furthermore, they've become wealthy partly because of mineral and agricultural exports, and secondly, conscious choices to integrate themselves into the global economy rather than remaining cowering behind protectionist barriers while trying to prop up in uncompetitive industries through subsidies. And where, one might ask, do northern hemisphere economies such as Russia's crony corporatist arrangements or the Middle East's petroleum economies fit into this north-south global economic schema? The answer is they don't. In short, if the north-south paradigm is how the Holy See understands the global geopolitical scene, it's effectively clinging to a perspective of the world economy whose profound limitations were already apparent by the early 1970s. Another problem with Laudato Si', again previously manifested in Evangelii Gaudium, is an oversimplification of the views of those who believe that free markets are the optimal economic way forward for individual nations in the global economy. Here's one example of what I'm talking about from the encyclical. Quote, "Some circles maintain that current economies and technology will solve all economic problems and argue that the problems of global hunger and poverty will be resolved simply by market growth." End quote. Well, growth is, of course, indispensable for saving people from poverty. There is no long-term remedy to persistent poverty without growth, and market economies have an unmatched ability to produce such growth. But whoever some circles might be, I don't know of any market advocates who think that growth alone is the answer to poverty. Many other things need to be in place, most notably the right moral, cultural, and institutional settings. These range from things like vibrant civil societies to something as fundamental as the rule of law, a course which is largely absent from most Latin American countries and about which Laudato Si', like Evangelii Gaudium, says absolutely nothing. Now, most free market advocates have been making these points for decades, but then Laudato Si' goes on to claim this. This is a longer quote, but this is what it says. They, whoever they are less concerned with certain economic theories, which today scarcely anyone dares defend, than with their actual operation in the functioning of the economy. They may not affirm such theories with words, but nonetheless support them with their deeds by showing no interest in more balanced levels of production, a better distribution of wealth, concern for the environment, and the rights of future generations. Their behavior shows that for them, maximizing profits is enough. Yet by itself, the market cannot guarantee integral human development and social inclusion. End quote. Well, leaving aside the sheer vagueness of the first sentence, who are they and what certain economic theories are being talked about, doesn't say who they are, it's hard not to view some of this language as verging on populism. The not-so-veiled claim that people who favour free markets are being disingenuous is a very serious allegation, and it's one that's not sustained by the briefest of glances at the writings and actions of many free market advocates, ranging from people like Wilhelm Röpke to people like Adam Smith himself. It's untrue, for instance, that being in favour of free markets means that in the heart of your hearts you're basically unconcerned with the environment and you're obsessed with profit. I know many free market supporters who have devoted their lives to trying to devise ways to align economic incentives in the direction of environmental protection. Nor is it just to say that free marketers are uninterested in future generations. It has been, for the most part, people who favour free markets who have been arguing that the current recourse to debt by Western governments in order to avoid making hard but necessary fiscal reforms is laying up enormous trouble for future generations. Those who are of a more interventionist or Keynesian disposition are generally silent about this subject, or they don't think it's a real problem. Lastly, you could probably count on one hand the number of free market supporters who believe that economic freedom alone will somehow assure human flourishing. Take, for example, Adam Smith. Now, not everything in Smith's thought is reconcilable with the Catholic and Christian vision of the human person. But Smith's vision of commerce and market exchange is rooted in a wider civilizational vision that, first of all, stresses the need for a strong civil society. Second, acknowledges that there are some things that only governments can do and that there will be times when government economic intervention is needed. And three, Smith underscores the importance of commercial, classical, and yes, Judeo-Christian virtues prevailing in a society if a free economy is going to flourish and benefit the majority rather than just privileged elites who enjoy close ties to the political class. Now, what's sadly ironic about all this is that the very same encyclical that makes such sweeping assertions about the free market and its advocates is also marked by several welcome calls for reasoned and broad debate about how we address economic and environmental problems. Laudato Si also emphasizes that the Church doesn't have a monopoly of wisdom on the prudential dimension of environmental and economic questions. Yet, the encyclical's use of phrases such as deified market and magical conception of the market, its unsupported association of moral relativism with Adam Smith's invisible hand, its relentless linkage of the market with materialism and consumerism, neither of which, by the way, have had any difficulty flourishing in non-market economies, the encyclical's failure to critique the left populist regimes that have brought economic destruction to countries like Argentina and Venezuela, and the encyclical's attribution of suspicious motives to those who favor free markets, that surely runs contrary to this appeal for an open and respectful debate. Now, it's true that some Catholic and Christian clergy and activists apparently think that dialogue with the world means listening more or less exclusively to what an increasingly atheistic and anti-Christian political left thinks about any particular given issue. This, however, is not an excuse for stigmatizing the position of those who make the simple, but I think very hard to deny point that the greatest and fastest reducer of poverty in history at the global and national level has been the market economy and the habits, culture, and institutions upon which entrepreneurship, free enterprise, and the growth of surplus capital ultimately depends. Now, I don't want to deny that some economic conservatives' criticisms of Pope Francis since 2013 have verged on what I think is the absurd. The briefest of glances at the Pope's writings underscores that Jorge Bergoglio is no liberation theologian. It's equally nonsensical to describe this Pope as a Marxist. Indeed, Pope Francis's pointed defense of the lives of innocent human beings from conception onwards, his forthright condemnations of euthanasia, and his increasingly ferocious criticisms of the fantasy world otherwise known as gender theory, contradicts the most basic contemporary left-wing orthodoxies. For all that, however, and despite what I think is the undoubted authenticity of the Pope's concern for the poor, it's lamentable that this pontificate seems unwilling to engage in a serious discussion about the market economy's moral and economic merits vis-a-vis the available alternatives. Society's well-being obviously can't be reduced to economic efficiency or growth, nor will, as I often say to students, free markets will not save your soul. But given the right ethical, social, and institutional environment, economic freedom and a vibrant commercial sector can go a long way to delivering us from the disease, the poverty, and the economic stagnation that marked most of pre-Wealth of Nations Europe and which still plagues much of the developing world. So in that light, I must say I was heartened when I read a transcript of the interview of Pope Francis that was conducted on his flight back from his recent trip to Latin America. After remarking that he had, quote, a great allergy to economic things because my father was an accountant, well, that makes sense, he was asked by a journalist about what were described as American critiques of some of his comments about economic subjects. And the Pope responded by saying this, quote, I have heard there were some criticisms from the United States. I heard about it, but I haven't read about it. I haven't had the time to study this well because every criticism must be received, studied, and then dialogue must ensue. If I have not had a dialogue with those who criticize, I don't have the right to state an opinion." End quote. Now, personally, I found these words very encouraging. First, they underscore a genuine humility, something shared by most popes, especially Pope Francis's immediate predecessors. Benedict XVI, who I'm convinced will one day be declared a doctor of the Church, and St. John Paul II, a great philosopher in his own right who played what I think was the decisive role in defeating the evil that was communism. Now, here we should recall that humility is not about self-abasement. Rather, it's a willingness to avoid pride, to know our limitations, and to recognize that none of us know everything. So concerning Pope Francis's invitation to dialogue, if I was going to make any suggestions, it would not be to study very specific issues such as the economic impact of air conditioning, which, by the way, has probably saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of people since its inception. Instead, I'd recommend that the Church first engage in closer study of the empirical data concerning poverty and economic inequality. Second, reflect upon the historical experience of economic growth and decline. 3, acknowledge that the past 30 years has witnessed some of the greatest and fastest reductions in global poverty and global economic inequality in history. And 4, and this might be the most controversial, pay attention to some of the insights into economic life that were developed first in the Anglo-American world. Now, all of this is important because, as Pope Francis wrote in Evangelii Gaudium, paragraph 232, he said this: "Ideas disconnected from realities give rise to ineffectual forms of idealism." End quote. Now, I think this insight is especially important when it comes to Christians making coherent contributions to economic debates. The Church is, after all, ultimately in the business of the truth. And the truth is surely one of the best antidotes to the sentimentalism and populism in which so much economic discussion today is mired, inside but also outside the Christian Church. Which brings me to a more general suggestion I'd like to make. Part of the truth-telling, which is core to the Church's mission, involves saying that even if we do live in a more economically better world, even if there are less poor people in that same global world, part of the Church's mission does involve living out its option for the poor so that Christians can help those who live in material poverty realize the integral human development to which everyone, rich, middle class, or poor, is called. In other words, it's not a question of compromising the Church's commitment to those in whom Christ himself tells us we see his face. Not at all. But there's no reason at all why the Church can't bring its commitment to the poor into contact with some of the truths that I've outlined tonight. Because if Christians care about reducing poverty and unjust forms of economic inequality, there are good reasons for Christians to speak, for instance, against tariffs, against subsidies, and against crony corporatism. If Christians care about the common good, then we should speak against populist policies that, in the name of equality, destroy the common good. If Christians care about the poor, then we should perhaps be a little less fixated on redistribution questions and pay more attention to the type of cultures and institutions that have demonstrated their ability to reduce poverty in relative and absolute terms. Now, I know that for some people this may all seem a little challenging, but none of these suggestions involve compromising on the demands of justice. They would, however, I think, allow the Christian Church to take wider account of the empirical without being empiricist, to look at what actually works without lapsing into sheer pragmatism, and to remove some of the conceptual blinkers that I think have inhibited many Christians' vision of how to transform the world's economies into arenas of human flourishing. And the well-being of the poor, I'd suggest to you tonight, surely demands nothing less. Thank you.